Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm Sandy Quinn. I'm president of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our magnificent East Room. This is a replica of the largest room in the White House. It's an exact replica. And above the room in the White House lives the First Family. And in this room, amazing things have happened in our history. For example, 7 presidents have laid in state in this room. Abigail Adams didn't have a washer dryer, so she hung her laundry up in big clothespins. Abraham Lincoln's son roller skated here. Teddy Roosevelt had the Rough Riders in here. Also, President Lincoln's son roller skated here. So if there's any of you, if there's any youngsters in here who have hardwood floors at home, you just go ahead and roller skate. Just say, well, it was the president did it, so I'm going to do it. It is my pleasure to welcome you, and I'm going to ask you to stand for the presentation of the colors. As they enter, I'm going to have Eric Hurtado from Orange High School, who will give the Pledge of Allegiance, come to the podium.
Everyone, sure. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, young Marines. They're from the 1st Marine Division at Camp Pendleton. Please be seated. We do this every year. We celebrate, we commemorate Memorial Day. President Nixon was a military officer in the South Pacific in World War II. He didn't, of course, die in the service, but he was a veteran and worked hard for veterans throughout his administration. His brother is here today, who was also in the military. He was in the Navy and a pilot. And I want to introduce several people to you now, including the president's younger brother, Ed Nixon. Ed? Now, Ed, you have to stand. Stand up, because when you see him from the side, isn't that, turn around, come on, see that? Look at that profile. He lives in Seattle, but he's one of our greatest supporters. Thank you so much, Ed, for constantly participating in what we do here at the Richard Nixon Foundation. I want you to say hello to the distinguished former United States Senator for 2 terms and Governor for 2 terms of the state of California, Governor Pete Wilson. Who looks exactly like Pete Wilson. And he was is a Marine himself. Lieutenant General John Tulin, Commanding General of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force at Camp Pendleton. Brigadier General Vincent Calanese, Commanding General of the 1st Marine Logistics Group, Camp Pendleton. Major General Matt Caulfield, who was Reagan's military aide. Major General Mel Speece, Deputy Commanding General of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, retired. Colonel Mike Naylor, former Chief of Staff to General Mattis. Distinguished people all, I've never felt safer at the Richard Nixon Library. We had a 21-gun salute out there. We've got more medals and ribbons and things than we've ever had here. But we really love doing Memorial Day programs as we do 9/11 programs and Veterans Day programs, because the Richard Nixon Foundation, of which I'm president, has great respect for the military, as did President Nixon, who created the all-volunteer Army and was a wartime president himself, who achieved peace in Vietnam. And it's our pleasure to present significant, distinguished speakers every year for this event, people who have something to say, who have had amazing, extraordinary careers of their own in the military, as we do today. And to introduce that speaker, we have a great friend of the Nixon family, of the Richard Nixon Foundation, a great friend of America, the former National Security Advisor to President Reagan, and a White House fellow, a good friend of mine, ladies and gentlemen, Bud McFarlane.
Thanks very much, Sandy. To any of the younger people in the audience today, if you anticipate having a career in public speaking, my only advice to you is if you can arrange to be introduced by your mother or Sandy Quinn, that's a good thing. Thank you for coming. Thanks for your motive in being here. For this day, we gather to honor heroes of our country who have given their lives, originally to honor those who lost their lives in the Civil War 150 years ago. And since being formally designated, we have gathered every year on this day to think hard about the blessing of being an American. What a privilege we enjoy. But we come here especially because we know that freedom and living under the rule of law, with independent court systems, opportunity, the chance to do anything you want with your life, isn't free. We've had to call our young men and women to arms again and again and again to preserve the freedom of our country. And it's in that tradition that today we honor and are blessed to have with us the most distinguished serving general officer in our armed forces, recently retired General Jim Mattis. Successful military leaders in writing memoirs and providing counsel to the next generation often give you attributes for victory in combat And often these summaries include, among other things, the ability to assess the strength of the enemy and their vulnerabilities, the ability to conceive a plan for overcoming the threat, a plan that makes the best use of our resources, both human and material, a plan that understands how to use the phenomenal supporting arms that are available in the military today. But perhaps most important at all, leadership requires the ability to inspire confidence in subordinates. The commander must be able to demonstrate that he knows what he's doing and he's going to get it done and we're going to win, and to inspire every one of his Marines. Victory. And you're going to be a part of it. General Mattis has done that, assessed the enemy, developed a plan, inspired confidence in his subordinates, and led his troops to victory, leading, by the way, from the front. At the platoon level, at the battalion level, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines in Iraq, at the regimental level, commanding the 1st Division in the march up to Baghdad, 2003. And then after promotion to the command at the force level, and ultimately as the commanding general of the Central Command, the next higher and ultimate level of commanding armies. Political leadership, not nearly as challenging, but important nonetheless, requires the ability to lead with aggressiveness and determination, and it does involve different skills. How, for example, to avoid war by using the other assets of national power, diplomacy, relationships with allies, economic power, and sanctions, among other things. Well, as perhaps the most well-read scholar of history and the art of war, General Mattis has demonstrated all of those qualities, both military and political. Diplomacy, relationship with allies, an understanding of the elements of national power of our country, military, yes, but beyond it. And his approach throughout his career has been to bring to bear a quiet, steady combination of intellect, knowledge of history, analytic skill, courage, competence, and the ability to inspire confidence that he knows what he is doing and he is going to lead to victory. That's all there is to it. He could do it again. Our country today is in desperate need of a leader to reverse the headlong decline that we are in at a time when respect for the United States has been in steady decline for many years. To restore it and to advance and protect American interests throughout the world, we need a proven leader. Such a man is General James Mattis. Welcome, General.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. We'll see if you clap like that when I get done. But as you can tell, it's wonderful to be introduced by a friend. And obviously, my mother did collaborate, Colonel McFarlane, with you. A fellow Marine, a patriot who paid your dues, your patriotic dues, sir, from Vietnam to Washington, and certainly a tradition carried on by your offspring, who I've also had the pleasure of serving alongside. It's a great privilege for me, ladies and gentlemen, to join you here in this beautiful corner of America on what can only be considered another picture-perfect Southern California day. And we know when we're lucky, don't we, when we get to be out here, to say the least. And it's been an honor, Edward, to meet you and Beth, your daughter, and the representatives of the Nixon family. A reminder that ultimately it just comes down to human beings, to American families, and we just all have different places in the way life unfolds for us, but to be reminded, too, that ultimately we're just people alongside each other. We sometimes disagree, we sometimes agree, but we're all Americans, and I think that's just a great sign to see the continued interest in the library as we pass on the lessons we learned in those tumultuous years back when the 37th president was in office. And Governor Wilson, Marine, yourself, wife Gail, just a man who pitched in and led by example. And I think that democracy demands participation, and we all salute you for your leadership by example, not sitting on the sidelines carping, but rolling up your sleeves and getting to work trying to make a better life. See a lot of our old friends here, Marines that I served alongside and I owe so much to. One note I will pass to you about General Tulin and his wife Helen. She has every right to want to kill me, by the way, for the jobs I gave her husband, the repeated deployments overseas. But John is going off soon to leave his 40,000 sailors and Marines behind here in Southern California, and he'll assume command of about 75% of the Marine Corps all over the Pacific, and the Marine Corps in our country could not be putting a more capable varsity player into this developing Pacific century than John Tulin. So it's very good to see all my old friends here today, and I would just tell you too, ladies and gentlemen, that we're here to celebrate those whose lives were lost in defending this great big experiment that you and I call America. And that's all it is an experiment. And I think that by pausing here today, we can put into some context some of the larger issues for which they gave their lives. And they did give their lives. They gave them for something. And I think that we recognize that among those who stood tall for America in a time of peril, we include a California native who was born here in Yorba Linda, Richard Nixon. And he's a graduate of Whittier College. And in 1942, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, he joined the Navy and served in the South Pacific. And eventually retired, by the way, as commander in the Naval Reserve. And oh, by the way, he also became the President of the United States and the Commander-in-Chief of the military along the way. But he had a great, truly naval career. And I have no doubt, Edward, that if he were with us on this day of tranquility that we spend together here, that the President would be recalling some very powerful feelings, because on Memorial Day, we celebrate so much of what makes America great. And we recall today that it is the most human terms of what we cost us in order to keep this country free. And those human terms, of course, are the toll paid to keep our freedoms, even as we celebrate the larger issues that make America great. It's a balancing act, being so proud of our country and certainly never forgetting those who have paid the ultimate price. Because we all know that this experiment that you and I call America is, and I'll quote here another president, only one generation away from extinction unless we protect it. And because we know this, we know that we need patriots who are willing to endure danger and discomfort for America's survival, many of whom are here today, including some who walked out of the Chosin Reservoir in that terrible winter of 1950-51 in Korea. It's appropriate, I think, if America is to pass intact our freedoms to the next generation, it's appropriate that we pause today to pay our respects to the generations of patriots, to those who throughout our history have signed what we call a blank check to the American people, a blank check payable with their lives. And generally, they were very young Americans, and they were more committed to living life fully than they were to their own longevity. And you know what I'm driving at here. The president in whose honor this library was named was one who believed so strongly in civil rights that when he found school segregation still existed in 7 states, some 14 years after the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, President Nixon went against the cautionary political advice, and he enlisted local leadership to finally integrate the schools. He did it wisely and without any reservation, and he achieved integration with none of the violence that was feared by those who were less bold than him and cautioned him and counseled him to be very, very tentative. The president who also brought our POWs home from the hell of North Vietnam's prisons, and that is an act for which the military will always hold him in the highest regard. That president and former naval officer would take pride, I think, ladies and gentlemen, in this moment, a moment when we recall all those who served, all their families, especially the Gold Star families who lost loved ones, losing what was most precious to them. As Colonel McFarlane said, Memorial Day's recognition dates back to our post-Civil War days, back when we decorated the graves of our dead. And in celebrating the lives of those to whom we owe so much today, those who have died in our nation's battles, we recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that we are born free by accident. We live free simply by choosing to live here in America, but we do have an obligation, and that obligation is to turn over to the next generation the same undiminished freedoms that we enjoy here today. As President Reagan said so well, freedom is not ours by inheritance. It must be fought for and defended constantly and by each generation, something that sobers me as I look at the young people here in the audience. So today we commit to remembering all those that we lost too young, for they fought to sustain that common purpose that was articulated so well by our founding fathers. And looking at Lieutenant Nixon and his service in World War II in the South Pacific, during that same time, the First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, carried in her wallet a prayer in the form of a poem. It accompanied her, by the way, throughout the war. She carried it everywhere, and it reads as follows. Dear Lord, lest I continue my complacent way, help me to remember somewhere out there a man died for me today. As long as there must be war, I then must ask and answer, am I worth dying for? Now, ladies and gentlemen, our America has both the power of inspiration and the power of intimidation. And in this imperfect world, even here in Yorba Linda, that means, of course, beautiful is what Linda means, translated into English. Even here, adjacent to an ocean named for the peace that Americans yearn for, we must have leaders with the wisdom to employ both powers, the inspirational powers and the powers of intimidation, each at the right place and time if we're to sustain our experiment in democracy. And we must note on Memorial Day that the all-volunteer force envisioned by our 37th president has stood the test, for in this, which is America's longest war, after more than a dozen years of fighting, our all-volunteer military, our ranks remain filled with high-quality volunteers. And these are young Americans who volunteered looking beyond the hot political rhetoric swirling around these little understood wars, and they have rallied to our flag. And I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that your military is not war-weary, and it is ready. An enemy who thought on 9/11 that he could scare us by hurting us, the maniacs who murdered over 3,000 innocent citizens of our country and of 70 other countries that bad September day, That enemy has been taught a hard lesson by the all-volunteer military that President Nixon was confident could protect our country. Our enemy learned that the descendants of those who fought and died in past battles, Bunker Hill and Shiloh, Belleau Wood and Midway, or the Solomons Campaign where Lieutenant Nixon served, who died at Iwo Jima or Pork Chop Hill and Khe Sanh, our enemy who believed he could scare us into paralysis learned this: we don't scare. That free men and women will fight like the Dickens, and the noble purpose for which we fight echoes down through the generations and even echoes to the far reaches of the world. We got to Kandahar after 9/11. It was about December. We finally had taken over the area. There were a lot of Taliban there, and the locals came up and they said, "We want to open the schools." And I said, "Certainly, no problem." And they said, "Well, we want to open the girls' school." You'll remember under the Taliban, there were no girls' schools. I said, "Of course." Well, the Taliban guys who are still in town had a very bad attitude about this. So we sprinkled our sailors, Marines, and Army Special Forces troops all over downtown. And standing there with their automatic weapons and the grenades hanging off them, little boys and girls on the first day of school walked out of their muddy little houses in their white shirts, and the girls with their little headscarves on, and the boys with their dark trousers and all, would proudly walk down the street. How many of you would have wanted your children walking down the city streets alongside foreign soldiers standing armed on the streets? That is the degree of trust people in muddy little villages had in the American military. And we are the good guys. We're not the perfect guys. We make mistakes at times. But the 8-year-old boys and girls of Afghanistan had figured this out. We're still trying to help the New York Times figure it out, but we'll get them there. But it is a reminder of just how special it is that we were born so fortunate in this country, that our military is seen in that light, the most envied military, this national treasure made up of all volunteer young men and women. Now, many of us here today have buried close friends who died in combat, some killed before our very eyes. And but for good fortune, it could have been us who died. And some of us are specifically alive today because of those who fell. And it will come as no surprise to you that I haven't the ability to put into words all that we feel about this. But I do recognize that every day I'm alive is a bonus, and our fallen shipmates give us impetus to live well and fully, to give attention and support to others, to find goodness in our fellow Americans even when we disagree. Memorial Day should encourage us all to put aside our pettiness in democracy's necessary squabbles and to find common ground in the country that our comrades died protecting. And we do this so we can make a better future for the nation we inherited from those who sacrificed all. In the fine tradition of President Nixon, who took grave political risk in his opening to China, who took risk in establishing the Environmental Protection Agency, recognizing that we had a need for protecting our air, land, and water for future generations. Such courage as President Nixon demonstrated would not be alien to the troops who fight in our nation's wars, neither World War II nor today's. And such courage should not be alien to all of us so fortunate to live today in America. For as our nation fights to get back on a fiscally sustainable path so we can ensure the next generation has the same economic freedom we enjoyed, as we fight our way back to a government by the political center, a place where compromise is a badge of honor, as we do these necessary things, courage will again be needed at the forefront, just as it was demonstrated by the World War II veterans who saw their buddies die and who came home to do better. Veterans who in war and peace led by example, with maturity and kindness for their fellow Americans, who refused the false security of withdrawing from the world, who even took political risk to keep America engaged, to keep our nation open to immigrants, to keep our schools open to foreign students who long for education in a truly free market of ideas. World War II veterans were unafraid to put America squarely in the middle of global trade, knowing that in free trade lay our future vitality that cannot be found in embargoes or withdrawal from the world. World War II vets returned home from a pretty crummy world. Tens of millions killed in 2 world wars. We'd ended 1 world war very vindictively that helped hatch a second one. 70 million, I can't even picture this, 70 million killed. Communism spreading, civil rights at home a blot on our beloved nation's honor. But their response demonstrated vividly that their comrades had not died in vain. They helped establish the United Nations to replace war with a forum for diplomacy. They set up Bretton Woods to build an international monetary system and then modified it when they found it didn't work right. They established NATO to build our defenses by aligning with other nations whose values grew out of the Enlightenment so we could stand together against communism, free trade to build wealth around the world, civil rights legislation, an issue which seized Richard Nixon and so many others who had fought for the rights of men as a universal right. There was also, among those veterans, one who had served as an officer in the U.S. Army, another California lad who was raised nearby here in Pasadena, a sparkling ball player named Jackie Robinson. He summed up our wonderfully imperfect country when he spoke from his heart so we could all hear our better angels, doing so in a manner that only a veteran could, a man who lost the comrades we salute here today. Jackie Robinson said, "I believe in the human race. I believe in the warm heart. I believe in man's integrity. I believe in the goodness of a free society. And I believe that the society can remain good only as long as we are willing to fight for it." So just as these 2 California veterans kept their faith in America's role, both at home and in the world, let us keep ours so we honor those who we have lost in the cause of freedom. To those who fought for our country, to those we lost, and to their families to whom we owe an irredeemable debt, we pause to honor today those killed in action. And we must every day answer that question in Eleanor Roosevelt's prayer, "Am I worth dying for?" And we must do that, we must answer that question while living a life aligned with Jackie Robinson's faith in our country, a country worth fighting for. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and God bless you all in our country, and certainly be with the lads as they go on patrol tonight in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the general has agreed to answer a few questions, so if you will raise your hand, I will bring the microphone to you. And we are live streaming all of this, so it's important that your question be into the mic. And if you'll raise your hand, as this gentleman is in the front row, please stand and state your name and question.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Greg. It's an honor to be here. My question is, what would leaving no residual force in Afghanistan mean for the security of the success of the mission and the future of Afghanistan? Thank you.
Yeah, the question about what would happen if we didn't leave a residual force there, I think it can be pretty well displayed throughout history. I mean, certainly in 1946-47, we didn't bring all the U.S. troops home from Europe or Japan. I think that when you look at what happened the first time there was a war fought in modern era in Afghanistan when the Soviets were beaten, we did not continue to lead with education programs and other things that might have helped cement a better future for Afghanistan. And with the enemy we're up against right now, the Taliban, who cannot win at the ballot box, that's why they use bombs, it's absolutely essential, I think, that we continue a commitment so that the price paid by our Gold Star families is not futile. We've got to stick with it and not forget that we've got to continue a contribution here, mostly in terms of advisors. I think the Afghan army is doing quite well against the Taliban, so it's not like we have to do the fighting for them, but they're still a very, very young army. And you remember when the French came and helped us in our Revolutionary War, they had to do quite a bit of helping, to tell you the truth, to get us to beat the redcoats. So same kind of thing, pass on freedom.
Thank you, General. Could could you comment on the situation in Iran, where we have said that it is unacceptable to have nuclear weapons, but it is somewhat evident that they're going to get them? What should we do?
Yeah, I'm not sure that we should accept that Iran's going to end up with nuclear weapons. There's a lot of decisions to be made. There are ways in which to make the cost-benefit ratio work against the regime in Iran, so they say that's probably not the best way to go. The economic sanctions put in place by the previous Secretary of State have been very onerous for Iran. That's why they came to the table. But this is a country, ladies and gentlemen, that we have got to look at what they really do, not what we wish for them to do. This is a country that tried to kill the Saudi Arabian ambassador to Washington, D.C., less than 2 miles from the White House. And were it not for one fundamental mistake, they probably would have succeeded and killed a lot of Americans in the process. If a country would do that without a nuclear weapon, what do you think that country would do if they had one? So it is absolutely essential, I think, that the U.S. government continue the same policy that we have had under Republican and Democrat presidents that say that they must not, Iran must not get a nuclear weapon. I think that if you look at what Colonel McFarlane mentioned about using all possible aspects of our power, economic, diplomatic, political, information, and certainly covert and, if necessary, military, that it's in our best interest that we continue the same policy right now.
General on the right side.
Good afternoon, sir. How you doing? You and I fought on the same battlefields. I'm sure you've had this question posed to you, but I'm going to pose it again. Are you thinking about running for presidency?
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, it's only his size and the fact that he fought alongside me once before. I don't go over and take a swing at him right now. No, I'm quite happy to have been associated with the Marines. I'm surprised they let me stay in the Marine Corps for 40-odd years, but it's time to turn over to the younger folks here, the country, that they're quite capable. I'm very confident that these young people can take the country forward.
One of our young ROTC members from Orange High School.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Eric Hurtado. I leave off to boot camp in December, and I just wanted to know if you had any ideas or suggestions on how my life would be a little bit easier over there.
Eric, we'll
You're
talk to
asking
you
the
afterwards,
wrong
young
man, I think.
There's a lady right here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to answer that.
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was waiting for you to answer it. All right. Can you step right over here, ma'am? Meanwhile, let me ask you if the stated reduction of our military strength is a good direction for our future defense, where I think I'm probably wrong on the figure, but it's in the 400,000s, I think.
The U.S. Army is coming down to 400,000. We are shrinking the military. We're in the midst of a war, and there's this enemy is not going away overnight. Any pronouncements that somehow that Al Qaeda is on the ropes and defeated, and Lebanese Hezbollah is all done, this isn't the case. However, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a fiscally unsustainable path right now, and we're going to have to figure a way to get the country back on a good financial status, good financial basis. Because if we don't, we will not be able to maintain that military. So if the military must shrink for some period of time, we are taking more risk, but the bottom line is our military is going to have to be used less if we do that. And what that means is, for those of you in here in the military today, we are going to do less with you. We must not do it less well. When the commander-in-chief orders you into a fight, you've got to send a shockwave back through our enemies that says we don't ever want to take these guys on again. When we meet the enemy for the first time in the next fight, and in the unfortunate history of the world, we know what's going to happen. You have got to make it very clear to the enemy it's going to be their longest day, and it's going to be their worst day when they run into you. And that's just the reality.
Thank you. Thank you, General. We're going to take one more question, and it's from this young lady in the front.
Thank you for calling me a young lady. You get points. As the war kept going on in Afghanistan, and being a student of history, I understood the incredibly important role of the poppy fields in the Afghan economy. And I know that we made efforts to try to get them over to be using different crops. Last night I was watching on C-SPAN an interview with a gentleman, and that was the topic of conversation. The money that the Taliban get, if it is 30% of the proceeds from the poppy crops, what really can we realistically do? From a political standpoint, we've done our military job, but from a political standpoint, to try to solve that problem.
Yeah, it's a great question about the role of the poppy fields and the opiates that are drawn from it. The challenge is very, very difficult to address. Until we can find substitute crops that are as hardy as the poppy, and the poppy is a very hardy plant, can grow in that difficult climate, that difficult ground, then it's going to be a challenge. What can we realistically do? I think the first thing we can do is find a more legitimate way, a more productive way to deal with our nation's own drug problem, which could then become a model for other countries, reducing the demand. And obviously this has to do with whether or not you criminalize, decriminalize, legitimize, delegitimize. There's all sorts of ways to deal with it. I'm not one to legitimize drug use. I think decriminalizing it and simply going after the pushers so that everything is focused on the pushers and users are put into some kind of required rehabilitation as we try to reduce the demand through something that's got to be more productive than declaring war on drugs 40 years ago, and look where we're at. We still haven't succeeded, and we're almost destabilizing Mexico with the amount of American dollars going down to Mexico. It's all part of this same culture that accepts it. I think we start by getting our own act together and recognize that in Afghanistan, this crop substitution and perhaps still has a chance, and I'll tell you why. If you have roads where farmers can get their crops to market before they rot, if you have some kind of refrigeration capability because you have electricity which allows them to store their crops so they actually have an option to feed their families without turning to the poppy, I think there are many people over there who would be more than eager to take this on. Remember back when this was on the hippie road, and I am old enough, you're not, to remember this, when Afghanistan was on the hippie trail, it was a place of orchards and wheat fields, and it exported pomegranates. I mean, this is not a country that doesn't know how to do this. It's a country that's been upended by the Soviet invasion and the current war against the Taliban. And if we can get the country's development such that decent farmers can make a decent living with other crops, then I think there's a chance to address that one directly. But the larger issue, I think we've got to address demand, and that's heavily us. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks again very much for having me here today.
Ladies and gentlemen, the General would like to say hello to as many of you who would like to say hello to him, so he'll be in the lobby, and you'll see some stanchions out here, so please pay your respects to him. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Bud McFarlane for coming all the way from Washington for a great right-on introduction. I want to thank Governor and First Lady Wilson for blessing us again with honoring us with your presence, and all this Marine brass. God bless America. God bless all of you. Thank you for coming.
Protecting and defending the greatest country on the face of this earth. God bless the USA. If tomorrow all the things were gone I worked for all my life, and I had to start again with just my children and my wife,